On the 2nd of April, the United States announced a range of tariffs on imports into their country, a day that the President Donald Trump termed Liberation Day. There was a blanket 10% tariffs on 60 countries. However, some of these countries saw higher tariff figures. African countries were not left out of what I would term the tariff lages, as Lesotho saw a 50% tariff, South Africa a 30% tariff, and our country Nigeria a 14% tariff. What does Nigeria have to lose? What does Africa have to gain? On the show this morning, we look at some of these policies. Welcome to Economy and Market, where we give you a comprehensive breakdown of market and economic activities. I'm David Olujimi, your host. On the 2nd of April, President Donald Trump declared what he called the Liberation Day, a sweeping move to impose tariffs on imports from 60 countries. While the baseline was a 10% tariff, some countries faced steeper tariffs, among them African economies like Lesotho with 50%, South Africa with 30%, and Nigeria with 14% found themselves in the crosshairs. So what does this bring? What does this mean for Nigeria? Let's break it down. Nigeria's 14% tariffs target key exports like cocoa and textile and even oil-derived products for an economy already grappling with inflation, currency pressures, and a reliance on crude oil, which notably was not directly hit. This could dent non-oil export ambitions. Small and medium enterprises banking on access to the US market may face shrinking margins. Some may even face job losses, and let's not forget, investors are watching this unfold, and some of them may eventually hesitate. We are in a period where Nigeria is trying to increase its output of crops like cocoa and some other agricultural outputs, and we are looking on how we can send some of these things over to the United States. Africa's story isn't just about losses, but our story is not just about how much we may lose. History shows us that protectionist policies often force economies to innovate. For example, South Africa has a tariff on steel and aluminium. The 30% tariff on South Africa steel and aluminium exports to America, it may hurt, but it also highlights the urgency of diversifying their trade partners. Now, this tariff brings into context the African Continental Free Trade Area, which now looks more vital than ever. Imagine African countries now increasing their trade with each other, adding value to raw materials domestically before exporting. For example, turning cocoa into chocolate, cotton into garments. Basically, that's how tariffs could inadvertently spoil industrialization for African countries. Can African governments act fast enough? Basically, Nigeria struggles with infrastructure bottlenecks and bureaucratic red tapes. All of this is no secret. Without urgent reform, reliable power, port efficiency, access to credit, the opportunity here remains theoretical. And let's ask the uncomfortable question. Are these tariffs a wake-up call or just another hurdle in a system stacked against emerging economies? What's the way forward? Nigeria and Africa must play the long game. Negotiate exemptions where possible, but also double down on regional integration and value-added industries. We need to now also increase partnership with EU, China, and India to offset US market risk. More importantly, invest in productivity. If this movement, some people have the opinion that if this movement pushes African leaders to tackle corruption, upgrade infrastructure, and empower local industries, then probably these tariffs won't be a death knell, but just a catalyst. On the show this morning, we'll be discussing with Aniyekan Joseph, a public policy analyst and vice president at Life Bank. Good morning, Aniyekan.
To hear from you and David. Good morning.
Yeah, so I'm going to start. First, tariffs are definitely going to undermine the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's the AGOA Act that was signed, I think, in 1996 between African countries and the US. So what does this mean for US-Africa trade dynamics?
Interesting question. The AGOA, in my estimation, was an act of kindness to sub-Saharan Africa by the US.
Okay.
To say, hey guys, you are struggling. Let us give you an opportunity to understand markets, build value chain that can then create some sort of catalysis to help you seek further trade benefits. AGOA took effect in 2000. It is likely to expire September 2025. In 25 years, what has sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Nigeria, been able to do specifically what capacities in trade, value chain analysis, logistical operations, integration of technology, in the last 25 years, have we learned enough to be competitive? We have to look at it and say, perhaps not. Because if we've been given this free opportunity for 25 years and we've not been really able to optimize, what are the chances that we can now compete when the time comes? I think, quite frankly, that the AGOA was a gift, and the tariff, which may come across as negative in this moment, will be the better gift, because it does appear that when something is free, it may not be valued.
Okay. I like that last part. When something is free, it may not be valued. Now we are pushed into a position where we may now have to, by force, look at how we can go around the tariff. So basically, over a significant portion of Nigeria's exports to the United States are oil related, crude oil and the likes. How will this tariff accelerate Nigeria's diversification into non-oil sectors? Or do you think it may just push us away from even looking at anything oil, non-oil exports? How do you think this is going to play for Nigeria's diversification into non-oil sectors like agriculture and manufacturing?
That's an interesting question, David. Again, we may be assuming that this tariff is going to force us to do something that we have not been able to do for decades. And we just need to ask ourselves the question, have we been able to process tomato from the north down south? Have we been able to effectively transport petroleum materials across the country, other agricultural materials? Agricultural waste is incredibly huge, even today as we speak in 2025. So the reality is, because we have not been able to optimize trade internally within the nation, we have not been able to optimize trade regionally within West Africa, what makes us think that we can optimize trade globally? Nigeria, for instance, is not optimized for global trade because we only trade or export via Lagos ports. And we have the capacity to have several ports across our Atlantic shoreline and specialize those ports. But we've not done that. So the reality is, yes, a good percentage of our trade is oil, but because we've not built the habit internally to trade competently, it is quite unlikely that we are going to learn now. This is because we are still enjoying the benefits of oil and its subsidiary trade, which is a significant part of our revenue. So we are still in that state of inertia when it comes to building capacity for trade internally, regionally, and of course, internationally.
You're not offering. You're not. It doesn't look like it's a very hopeful situation. The way you are, the way you are going about, it doesn't look like we have so much hope. When you say we're in a state of inertia, it means that we are in a state of absolute rest, kind of. One thing I would also want to talk about. So you talked about the fact that Nigeria is not optimized for internal trade. I noticed something. I've always thought, it's always been an idea in my head about the fact that how Nigeria tariffs itself. So I think we have some form of export tariffs in Nigeria. So for example, I think that was earlier this year, the Oyo State announced new taxes. If you want to carry any food product above a particular quantity out of Oyo State, you're going to pay a particular tax amount. They implemented it, I think that was last year, December or November, very late last year. It's the same thing with most of the states in Nigeria. First of all, when you are bringing anything into their state, you pay taxes. When you are taking anything out of their state, so in Nigeria we have import tariffs from, let's say, from Kogi State to FCT. Then you
Yeah.
have export tariffs
Yeah.
from Ondo State to, let's say, Ogun State. It's a very weird dynamic, and I don't know. What's your take on it? Do you think that we should probably look inward and begin to look at how we can optimize internal trade before we begin to reason how we can now start to optimize external trade?
David, you're absolutely right. Again, if you do not know, if you have not learned how to write your ABCs, you're unlikely to write a book.
Okay.
So being fluent in internal trade gives you the muscle memory, the infrastructure, the systems, the competencies, the personnel to be able to execute it regionally. And then with little lessons learned, you are likely to do it globally. That said, as a matter of fact, the tariffs you have mentioned across state lines are not the biggest concerns. As a matter of fact, if we had safety, security, and infrastructure, most producers will be willing and happy to pay those prices. So there are even more significant tariffs that are a
Hmm.
function of weak state capacity that people have to pay.
Wonderful. Okay. Now, I was looking at something. So basically, we saw yesterday the US Trade Representative Office, they made a statement about how Nigeria's import ban on certain goods are some of the policies that have driven them to do what they've done. And I also paid attention to some of the goods that Nigeria exports to the that we import from the US. When I looked at it, I looked at some of our biggest imports from the US. We have wheat, we have cars, gadgets, and all of those are the basically we have tariffs on wheat, we have tariffs on cars, we have tariffs on gadgets. But basically, most of the other things we import, aircrafts, I think steel, they are basically tariff free. Do you think we have the leverage for a reciprocal tariff system? Is Nigeria in that position do we have that leverage? Are we like EU, or are we like China, or we are probably like Taiwan, who just will just go to US and say, don't worry, we're removing all our tariffs?
If wheat were not in that list, we may have we may be able to force a negotiation, for instance. But you know, David, that wheat is critical to the
Yes,
staple nutrition
of
of
Nigerians.
the majority of the multidimensionally poor Nigerians. As a matter of fact, wheat is a commodity that has national security consequence. So if wheat were not in that capacity, we would say that our export cost is positioned to benefit the 1% of Nigerians who are importing vehicles from the US, either for business or personal purposes. However, because of the component of wheat, you are forced to have to take this bitter pill. If we are going to change that, we now need to take a look at what it would take, for instance, to collaborate with other nations that are strong in wheat trade, or look internally to say what percentage of wheat consumption can we take up locally.
Okay, okay. So basically, in your opinion, we don't have that leverage for we don't have for
Retaliation is not on the
retaliatory.
table, unfortunately. No.
Okay, now how can African countries leverage on our regional trade to offset some of the losses that may occur from US tariffs? So, for example, I see that about 40, I think there's about 30 to 40% of all of Lesotho's exports goes to America. 50% of their textile exports goes to America. I think the same thing with Benin Republic. A very large chunk of their textile export goes to America. So basically, how do you think these economies can come together now to begin to ramp up internal trade within themselves to try and offset these losses that may occur from the American tariffs?
I think low hanging fruit has always been the a strategy that most people go to. The ability to earn forex has incredible short-term impact in any economy.
Okay.
However, because of the easy access to financing that exporting to countries like Europe and US that have strong currencies have on our economy, we are fixed. It's like a drug. This thing makes sense. Let's continue to do it. If I am going to sell to other countries and the idea is to sell in their local currencies, why take that effort when the impact that the dollar has on my economy might potentially be better? Except, of course, we are going to be willing to denominate that trade in dollar, and then the incentive is stronger. The downside of that is the Africa economy, dollar costs so much to acquire. So it's always better to earn dollar than to buy dollar. And every time economies in Africa have tried to hedge their currency against the dollar, it has always been a losing battle. So for intra-Africa trade to really work, the idea of a strong currency needs to come up. That currency is what now drives the incentive and the motive for intra-trade. So it's easier for me to earn $10,000 than to earn maybe $1 million of a neighbor's currency.
I've always had, so you said something about the strong currency aiding intra-Africa trade. I've always had personally, I've been of the opinion, I've always thought, why can't the Naira, probably within the West African context, fit into helping aiding trade? Do you think our Naira is anywhere close to being the strong currency that can dominate trade in West Africa, not even across Africa, just in West Africa?
Um, Theoretically, absolutely. There's no reason why not. Nigeria has the population, potentially the markets, potentially the diversity of cultures and people indicates that there's going to be a number of unique needs and cultural requirements and demands that will drive the diversity, that will drive the West African economy. Theoretically, yes, we do.
Okay.
However, from a state perspective, there is a capacity issue that investors, especially our West African neighbors, will look at and say, we do not have the consistency in policy, execution, and we have not built the fluency internally. Like I said to you earlier, even intra trade within the nation, we are struggling with it. How much more, trade within the region? And these are the things that we need to be honest about ourselves to say it is until certain state-related issues are addressed, then other countries within the region will look at Nigeria and have trust in the systems that we have built, and they can now make a bet on that system. Then the investments will flow.
Okay, so just very lastly, these tariffs, there's a trend of global protectionism. We've seen it with China. China has very weird tariffs. India has very wonderful, the word I use is wonderful. They have very wonderful tariff system. Basically, we have this trend of protectionism. I think America coming up with this tariff system brings all of it to the front line, and it's making it look like, oh, this thing did not exist before, but it exists. So what lessons can be learned from past trade wars? Do we have any trend of trade wars that have taught us lessons that we can learn from?
Obviously, when we look to history, we can learn lessons. The downside of looking back in history is that the contexts are not the same.
Yes.
So while the situation is understood, the contexts are different, and making a direct comparison will not be fair. I'll give you an instance. When the US started dishing out all of this free trade to the rest of the world, it didn't have 300 million population. It didn't have several wars it was fighting, and it didn't have 22 trillion in debt. Now, America is in debt, is struggling with employment of its people. There is a drug addiction problem. There is a mental health problem, and it needs to give its people an opportunity to be gainfully employed. America's middle class in the last 30 years has been decimated. It needs to be rebuilt. So when you compare the context, you will recognize now that for America, it's caring about its people in the way African leaders need to care about her
its
people.
people. Okay, wow, that's a lot to unfold. But thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Aniek and Joseph. It's been an
Always a pleasure.
insightful conversation having you here. Um,
Thank you, David. Thank you,
thank you.
David.
To our viewers, thank you for tuning into Economy and Markets this morning. It's been great having you here. We'll see you again on Friday. Have a wonderful day.